You guys have been sitting zazen and did service?
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, well, let's get started then. Yeah.
Well, we can do an opening chant.
We've been doing zazen here. We have a retreat going this weekend, so we're merging our events here. Presently in Newton, Iowa, and one of the places where we practice at, Pure Land of Iowa, has a home that they use for retreats like this. So you see a beautiful Buddha behind me. And I just want to introduce you. So there's other folks here too. There's a couple other folks. Introduce you to Mark and John.
Good morning.
Howdy.
All right.
We'll do the opening chant first. Response. Dharma is vast and subtle. Dharma is vast and subtle. We now have a chance to see this. We now have a
chance to
study this and practice this. Study this and practice this. May we realize this true meaning. May we realize this true meaning.
All right. It's good to see everybody, and I'm looking forward to returning the first weekend of November. I've already got a lot of ideas and and things planned for us for that weekend, but hopefully we'll talk more about that, and you'll get something in the next newsletter about it. So if I could get the screen sharing capacity, that would be great. A little. Let's go. Last time I spoke, the title was Zen Healing, and I didn't get to say half of what I was planning to say, so this is going to be a part 2 to that. And as I was thinking about what to say, I added more, so see how far we get with this one. There may be another part.
Okay, I should be able to do it now.
Okay, thanks so much. All right, so I want to remind you all of the writing of Dogen that we started out with. Go out and bring back one stalk of medicinal herbs. So this is Manjushri speaking to Sudana, and Sudana is the student, Manjushri is the embodiment of wisdom, and we can see images of Manjushri here. And basically, I'm going to just fast forward through some of these. Buddhism, or the Buddha, has at least, according to one book I've been studying, 3 ways to undo suffering. So I emphasized last time that suffering could be something that takes place on the end of suffering is not just spiritual, but also physical. And I think in the modern times, we tend to separate those 2 things out. We go to a medical doctor for what ails us physically, We go to maybe a minister for what ails us spiritually. We might go to a psychologist for what ails us mentally. But these three fields, the physical, the mental, and the spiritual, are all interconnected. And we see evidence of that in early Buddhist teaching. So there's basically three causes to suffering, and there's three ways to heal suffering. Right? One is through physical means, in the time of the Buddha, could be herbs, food, or surgery. Another cause of illness is spiritual causes. So not understanding, for example, no self or impermanence. That can create physical illness as well. And then there is also the idea that healing is the process of spiritual growth. Healing is a metaphor for spiritual growth. Whether what ails us is a physical illness, a mental illness, or a spiritual illness. I began, I left off last time talking about these three spheres in which health needs to be addressed within Buddhist practice. And right off the start, so diet, exercise, and sleep. And right off the bat, I want to say that there's a continuum of wellness in these three spheres. And I can't remember who it was, but somebody mentioned also how social engagement also affects us, our health, our physical well-being, our mental health well-being, and our spiritual well-being. So social engagement, just coming together as a sangha, is important for our health. So I want to acknowledge that, but we're going to focus in a little bit more, dig a little deeper into this first one that's written here on diet. And as soon as I bring up the word diet, I wonder what comes to mind. I can guess that it's probably not. I mean, people often struggle with diet, what they eat, and all of that kind of thing in our society. So we need to, I want to recognize that there's a great difficulty in this particular subject, and it might push some buttons for some of you. But the intention in doing this is to just have us look at this again from another angle, because it really is something that we all struggle with, and for various reasons. And there's no blame whatsoever to any of us as to where we are in this scale of well-being when it comes to diet. However, I want to have us look at the connection between spiritual well-being and physical well-being, particularly through diet, and how it has been understood in Buddhist teachings. So I'm going to share a story from the Zui Monkey, Dogen Zenji Zui Monkey. And this particular story is connected with the consumption of meat. In the assembly of Zen master Bussho, there was a monk who, when he was sick, wanted to eat meat. The master allowed him to do so. All right. So first of all, it's interesting to me that this would be a point that's raised, that a monk was sick, and so we have to kind of intuit, well, why is this an issue? It might not be immediately obvious for our times that meat eating. Why is it an issue for this monk to be eating meat? So I just want to put that out there. Why do you think this is an issue?
Hi, Daishin, Benji here.
Hi, Benji.
Because it's one of the precepts, do not harm, and that involves killing of an animal. That's just kind of my guess.
Exactly. You're right on the money there. Right on the money. I mean, it's one of the precepts. Well, the very first precept is do not kill. And in Buddhism, that extends to all sentient beings. And when we look at the first vow, beings are numberless. I vow to save them, or I vow to free them. How do we put those two things together when it comes to what we consume? And what's the connection between killing and the food that we eat and this first precept? Because we have to eat. Anyways, monks are, at least traditionally, expected to refrain from eating meat. And I was mentioning earlier today that actually in the time of the Buddha, they could eat meat, but only if it wasn't killed, if the animal wasn't killed expressly for the monk. If the monk learned that the animal was killed expressly for their consumption, then they were not permitted to eat meat, because then they would incur the karma from having that meat killed. But they could eat meat if it wasn't killed expressly for them, because it had already been killed. I want to share with you also a story. This is from how the swans came to the lake.
I'm sorry. What would that be? I mean, like it's like roadkill or
Well, I'll give you an example. I'll tell you this story. So there was when I was at Mount Equity Zendo training, there was a monk there who came from. He was Chinese, but he had been training in the Burmese Buddhist tradition, and they practiced the Vinaya quite strictly in that tradition that he was in. And he stayed with us for a weekend, for a couple of days, I think it was. And he gave a Dharma talk. And somebody asked him about vegetarianism and eating meat. And he said that he gave this exact ethical code that if a piece of meat was given to you and you learn that it was given to you expressly for you, then you're not permitted to eat it. And they actually practice that. So he gave a story of he had recently gone to see his sister and stayed with her. And she was so overjoyed, so happy to see him, made a big feast for him. And she put a plate of shrimp in front of at the table in front of him, and she said to him, "I made this shrimp just for you." And when he heard that, he said, "I'm sorry, I can't eat it." And so I wouldn't be surprised if you have questions or thoughts about this, and I welcome them. But we might be surprised to hear that. You'd wonder, why couldn't he have been polite and accepted it? And I brought that exact question up to my teacher. I said, what do you think? Well, I wanted to get her perspective. What do you think about, from your tradition, from the Japanese Zen tradition, what do you think about this teaching that you shouldn't eat meat if it was made expressly for you, and what the monk did with his sister? So I wanted to know, what did my teacher think? So she said, if it was me, I would have eaten it. Right? So that kind of gave me some more pause. Like, there's some distinctions between these traditions. But I want to also back up a little bit and share a little bit about my own teacher's experience with food in a Japanese Zen monastery. First of all, she lived in a a nuns a training temple specifically for nuns in Japan, and the nuns were not well resourced. It's there's patriarchy, there's sexism, and they were not well resourced, and their diet was poor. Consequently, they had very little protein in their diet and lots of brown rice that they ate. Of course, brown rice is good for you, but with the absence of a decent amount of protein, it's basically getting a lot of carbs. And she succumbed, within a year, she succumbed to malnutrition, which took her another 9 months to recover from. She had to leave the training monastery and go to a Pure Land temple where she recovered. And it took her a full 9 months before she was not even fully recovered. And even today, the doctor said because of that malnutrition that you got, later in your life, you will have issues, you'll have memory loss issues. And today, she certainly does have some serious memory loss issues because of, most likely, at least according to that doctor, it's stemming from malnutrition. And so it's not uncommon in Japan for monks in training monasteries. Well, first of all, the diet sometimes doesn't give enough protein. And so they will often supplement that by going out to a store and buying some personally, but they never eat it in the monastery. There's another story in this book, how the swans came to the lake. And this is about Soyen Shaku. He was one of the first Soto Zen, not Soto, he's actually a Rinzai Zen priest that came to the very first Parliament of World Religions at the turn of the 19th century, 1890s. And he had traveled widely in those days, which is highly unusual if you think about it. But he went to Sri Lanka to train. And I think that was prior to his going to the Parliament of World Religions. And let's see if I can find it.
Oh, that's now, okay.
Can you hear those insects? Is that on your end?
That is. It's not on our end. Is it on our end? I don't think it is.
Not on your end?
Oh,
Oh, okay. Maybe try mute. Oh, there it goes. If it happens again, you could try muting.
Yeah, I think that's just feedback.
It must be from somewhere else.
I'm sorry, I thought I had this marked, but apparently not. Ah, here it is, here it is, here it is. Okay. So this was his experience in Sri Lanka. He says, at first he thought it strange that the bhikkhus who followed the Vinaya so strictly ate meat offered on their begging rounds. When the monks told him, quote, if you do not hear the killed victim's suffering voice, or do not know that the killing was made especially for you, then the meat is clean. Right? In other words, there's no karma incurred by that. So listen to the conditions. If you do not hear the killed victim's suffering voice, or do not know that the killing was made especially for you, then the meat is clean. And then the commentary on this says, Soyen Shaku worried that this justification would reach the Japanese sangha, and he asked his teacher not to tell the monks in Japan about this particular custom, because it would basically then justify what the monks were already doing, plenty of, probably. No. So let's go back to that story in the Zui monkey. One night, the master himself went to the infirmary and saw the sick monk eating meat in the dim lamplight. A demon was clinging to the monk's head, eating the meat. So imagine that. The teacher goes to the infirmary. He wants to check up on this monk that's not well, and gives him permission to eat meat. And then he goes to the infirmary, sees the monk, but he sees that it's not the monk eating the meat, but a demon sitting on his head. So we have to look at this as allegory, as symbolism. Right? We don't want to take this too literally. A demon was clinging to the monk's head, eating the meat. Although the monk thought he was putting it into his own mouth, it was not him, but the demon who was eating. After that, whenever a monk fell ill, the master allowed him to eat meat because he knew he was possessed by demons. All right. So this is one, again, if we take this literally, we can go down the rabbit hole of demon possession, and that's not really where I want to go with this. I'd rather, I mean, it's one possible interpretation, but I'd rather like to look at this more symbolically, this idea of because a demon is not just it's in Buddhism. Yeah, we talk about demons, but they're in our own mind. They're part of our own mind. And so what are we feeding? And we all have our demons. This is something that we need to recognize, is that all of us have within us demons, and they get hungry and they need to be fed. Or do they? Do you want to starve the demons? What happens when you starve your demons? Usually they come back really powerful and much, much stronger. Does this mean, is this a justification for eating meat, though? I don't think it's a justification for eating meat, but we do need to recognize our own demons. And we need to become skillful in, I think one of the traps that we get caught in Buddhist practice is that we might go through a period of time where we feel altogether pure, where we sit on our seats, we attain some level of concentration, our minds are clear, and we think, oh, I got it, okay, this is it. If I just keep doing this, this is the practice for me. But inevitably, our demons will return. A lot of us, for example, we come to the practice with some serious addiction issues. It could be drugs, it could be sex, it could be sleep, it could be money, it could be workaholism. These are all serious addiction issues. And we want to remember that they're present in our minds as well, no matter how much work we do to alleviate the suffering that is created through addiction. And what is addiction? I want to expand that to anything that we do mindlessly, anything that we do that feeds a craving and at the same time hurts us in some way. So I don't want to justify feeding our addictions, but to recognize that there is within all of us addictive patterns of being, ways of being that are hurtful, that are harmful to ourselves, harmful to others. And if we start to look at the causes of addiction, oftentimes we can find some earlier trauma that precipitated those addictions or those addictive behaviors. And so the good feeling that comes with an addiction is a way to deal with an old injury that hasn't been well dealt with. Okay. Let's go on to the next. So Dogen says, Zenji says, thinking about this story, we must carefully consider whether to allow it or not. And he's talking about eating meat. Whether allowing or prohibiting it, all the ancient masters surely had their own deep considerations. I love this, that Dogen doesn't just allow it because other people are doing it. I think we have to really have our own. It's not just the ancient masters that have to have their own deep considerations for whether to eat meat or not, but it's each of us too. We need to look at how does what we eat bring health to our own physical bodies, bring health to those in our family, those that we're feeding, and what had to happen in order for the food to get to our plate. It's not just the ancient Zen masters or a teacher having deep considerations. Each of us has to have our own deep considerations when it comes to eating meat. I recently came across a writing by Karen Armstrong, and maybe some of you have heard of Karen Armstrong. She was a former Catholic nun, and she left the convent and she studied world religions quite widely, and she has a recent publication out called Sacred Nature. And I was looking at it last night, and I came across right at the beginning, there's a chapter on sacrifice, and right at the beginning of that chapter, she talks about animal sacrifice and how that was an important part of many cultures around the world. It wasn't just in certain locations, it was around the world that animal sacrifice was an important part of religious ceremonies where an animal would be killed. And she makes this very important point. She says, today we would think of it as barbaric to have an animal sacrifice as part of a religious event. Yet, those who lived in ancient times would look at us in modern times and how we kill animals as barbaric, the extent to which we consume animals. So she gives a nice reversal on our thoughts about this. And largely because the killing of animals is out of our consciousness, it's out of our mind. It happens behind doors, very heavily locked doors that we don't see. We're not in touch with what's actually had to happen in order for our food to get onto our plate. Okay. So going back to this slide. I want to share from the Brahma-Net Sutra. So this would be, the Brahma-Net Sutra is the sutra that we recite when we do the full moon ceremony. And this is we don't recite the entirety of the Brahma-Net Sutra. But this is one section that I think is worthy of hearing. So there are grave precepts. These are precepts that we definitely should refrain from. And then there are less grave precepts. And the precept I'll share with you right now is considered the third less grave precept. It says, disciples of the Buddha, should you willingly and knowingly eat flesh, you defile yourself by acting contrary to this less grave precept. Let us not eat any flesh or meat whatsoever coming from living beings. So this is really black and white. Anyone who eats flesh is cutting himself off from the great seed of his own merciful and compassionate nature, for which all sentient beings will reject him and flee from him when they see him acting so. Right, so to kill a sentient being is to create distress, but even to eat meat, according to this precept, we cut off our ability to have compassion for others when we consume meat. This is why all bodhisattvas should abstain from eating the flesh of any and all sentient beings. So there's a note in the sutra that I have. It says, abstaining from eating meat arises from compassion, not from sentimentality. In some Buddhist countries and under some medical circumstances, the practice of eating meat is accepted because of the limitation of other sources of sustenance. And that's true for the Tibetan culture, where it's very mountainous and cold. If they just refrained from eating meat, they would probably die. So that's not been followed. But we need to consider where we live in our time and how meat is actually handled. And if you have not seen videos put out by societies that promote the welfare of animals and being watchful of what we eat and the meat that we eat, then you really should. And if you have watched those videos, then you know what I'm talking about. But we do have to be careful about, the point again is not to shame ourselves, but like Dogen is saying, all of the ancient Zen masters must have had deep considerations for allowing the eating of meat. And have you thought about it? Right? Have you actually considered this for yourself? Don't wait for somebody to tell you. Will Tuttle, he's the author of the World Peace Diet. I actually got to meet him. Oh man, it must have been at least 15 years ago. He came to Williamsport, Pennsylvania, which is about 20 minutes from Mount Equity Zendo, where I trained. And he had written this book, The World Peace Diet. I'm not sure if anybody there has read it or heard of it, but I didn't give it much thought at that time because my teacher didn't give it much thought because, like I mentioned, she had malnutrition and eating chicken was medicine for her. So that's how she saw it. Eating meat was medicine for her. And so I just kind of let this one go. And occasionally we would eat meat, but usually it was, we never bought it at the temple or for the temple, but occasionally we would go out and I would have a hamburger, I confess. And but we would go to like a restaurant to do that. So I kind of disregarded the book, but I've circled back around to it, and I'm trying to think about this more deeply. The past several years, I've been basically vegetarian, leaning towards veganism, but trying to be open to what I receive, so as not to be rude in the face of company or that kind of thing, family that serves meat, etc. So it's an ethical challenge that I think is formidable for us in modern times, and especially in American society, and especially in the Midwest. Here in Iowa, we've got hog farm. Hog confinements it's one of the biggest revenues for this state. And the presence of these hog confinements is affecting our water quality. you can't drink the water unless it's highly treated here in Iowa. Down in Des Moines, the water that comes out of the tap is very chemicalized. And this is a direct result of the farm runoff, not just from the corn and soy fields, but also from the manure, the hog manure that's so in excess that it goes into the rivers. You can't swim in some of the lakes because it has E. coli in it. And this is all local. So we need to start putting the connection here between the health of ourselves and the health of our local environment. But here, Will Tuttle, he says, we will only survive and thrive if we recognize the central power of our meals to shape our consciousness. Food is eaten and becomes the physical vehicle of consciousness. And consciousness chooses what to incorporate into itself from itself. Do we cultivate and eat fear or love? Terrorized animals or nurtured plants? We cannot build a tower of love with bricks of cruelty. Now, Will Tuttle, he practiced in the Korean Zen tradition, Korean Buddhist tradition, where they had practiced vegetarian eating for several centuries in the particular place that he studied. So he's also coming at this from a Buddhist perspective. And I think I'd like to close on this. I'm going to skip that, but I want to close on this 5th mindfulness training that Thich Nhat Hanh has written. You know, the 5th mindfulness training, or the 5th precept, is referring to not consuming alcohol. That was the traditional precept. And it's kind of been extended to drugs as well. But Thich Nhat Hanh really expands it much further. He talks about unmindful consumption. Aware of the suffering caused by unmindful consumption, I am committed to cultivating good health, both physical and mental, for myself, my family, and my society by practicing mindful eating, drinking, and consuming. I will practice looking deeply into how I consume the 4 kinds of nutriments: edible foods, sense impressions, volition, and consciousness. Right, so he goes on there, but he also makes the connection between the state of consciousness of an animal prior to its being killed, and that we're also consuming. You know, if we're consuming anxious and irritable animals, then that becomes incorporated into our flesh as well. It's not an easy subject. And I want to open this up for conversation without any blame or shame around it whatsoever. But I think it needs some conversation. So I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Well, this is Pam. I'll start off here. This is a really interesting subject to me because you know, I've had people ask me for advice on, you know, what kind of diet, but I also remember Nolan, you know, once he started to accumulate health problems,
Right.
he was advised by his doctor that he really needed more protein in his diet, and so he started eating meat.
Right.
And you know, to me, that's just emblematic of the considerations that come into this. And then, you know, on the other hand, if you look at modern science, can we assume that, you know, all the plants we eat are nurtured and are happy to see
Right.
the harvester coming along toward them? You know, plants are more sentient than we once thought they were. So, you know, it raises all sorts of considerations. I mean, to me, it always sort of came down to being as aware as you can of what you're eating and what you're doing, and, you know, making decisions based on, you know, being super mindful of what are the what are the causes and conditions and effects of your actions, maybe. Brian?
Brian, this is really challenging for me because I have always associated when I create a meal for my family as I'm loving my family and I am bringing joy to them. So Thanksgiving is the big turkey with all of the traditional sides and everything like that. And it's a very joyful time for me and my family. So I'd like to, with Thanksgiving here coming up here shortly, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's the case for so many of us. It's a time for families to get together. I'll throw it back at you though too, because certainly there's a lot of love put into meals, and this is what makes it problematic. There's a lot of love put in the meals, but I also wonder, like, outside of the meals, how are the relationships in the family? You know, what goes on outside of the meals? What are the conversations like at the dinner table? I don't know about you, but my family, it's absolutely, there's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of hurtful, there's a lot of judgment. It's a time to like get right with whoever's the one who's the most powerful in the family. You know, so that also, you know, our families have a lot of dysfunction in them. Maybe that's not the case for your family. So, you know, every situation is different, and there's no blanket right answer. But I would just encourage, like, look at how the family is as a whole. And does everybody eat meat? Does everybody want? I mean, more and more, there's a lot of families, they get together, and this person's a vegetarian, that one doesn't care, and you know, and so you're making different kinds of meals already. Or are people actually being forthright with how they're feeling? Do they feel safe enough to be able to share, you know, like, I don't feel comfortable eating this meat, right?
Daishin, thank you, and what an interesting topic. I don't think diet's talked about enough really in our society. It's such a like touchy subject. Telling somebody that they shouldn't eat meat. Well, I mean, you're not telling us we shouldn't eat meat. You're telling us, or you're bringing the topic up to like look at it. And I agree that I don't think it's like sustainable, really, and there are some like implications for your health. I guess my question is on a nutritional like perspective. I don't think I need copious amounts of protein. I think I can get a good source from like peanut butter and stuff like that. And I really don't eat that much either. So it's because I'm not like trying to like bodybuild. But I guess my question is, how do you tell somebody or bring it up to their attention in a way to demonstrate that they don't need as much protein, or to cut through like the societal, cultural, like American implications that you should eat meat? Right.
Yeah, and that goes back to Brian's question, like, even if you can't end eating meat, can you reduce the amount that you eat? That in itself would be a huge blessing. So maybe you have turkey, but maybe you also have smaller portions of it. Maybe you have a lot of balance with vegetables and things like that. So, you know, looking at the quantities, if we look at other countries and meat consumption patterns, I'm thinking of Japan in particular, where the meat is usually, if there's meat, then it's a small percentage of the overall meal. Maybe 5% is meat, red meat or chicken or something. So, again, I don't know if that helps, but another thing I should share here is the health issues around eating meat, the overconsumption of meat. So somebody like Nonan, I totally, he practiced vegetarianism for the most part for probably most of his practicing life until his health started to wane. But that's the exception. That's the exception. That's not the prevailing norm. The prevailing norm is health issues stemming from the overconsumption of beef, particularly like heart disease, I'm thinking of. So when I was 16, my father was, he was lucky to dodge the bullet of a heart attack. He had to have a double bypass. And this was in the early 1990s, maybe just at the turn of the 1990s, when bypass surgery was just kind of becoming a common thing. And I remember him describing the surgery where they have to break your sternum and pry open your rib cage, stop your heart from beating to do this surgery. Right there, that is a very violent process. I don't think they do it that violently anymore, but at least 30 years ago they did. And as a result, my father started looking into the causes of his atherosclerosis, like so many people have. And one of the chief causes, besides stress, was red meat. And he said he came across one writing where he talks about heart attacks as the cow's revenge.
Mhm.
Right? There's a lot of truth in that. And consequently, my family, at least for the year before I went to college, greatly reduced our red meat consumption because of that. My father was like, we have to either stop or reduce our red meat. And my mother was very concerned for his health, so she did that. And I went off to college, and I went into college with that impression in my mind, like, maybe I should eat less meat. And meanwhile, modern medicine has made more advances where we can take pills now to work on the biological level. But look what happened for my father. Basically, his diet went back to what it was, without any consideration for meat consumption. And my mother really didn't. It's not that she didn't care, but again, she's Italian American. Italian Americans eat loads of cheese, loads of meat, and that is associated with love. And so this is such a difficult issue. How do you tell somebody if they don't make this connection between health and the overconsumption of meat? Consequently, so maybe 15 years later, my father again dodged another bullet with a stroke. He had a brainstem stroke, which could have killed him. I was 35 then. So first I was 16, so about 20 years later, he has a brainstem stroke. It's caused from the same thing, atherosclerosis, except in a different part of the body. 15 years again come, and my father's heart is falling apart. He has clips now that they surgically implanted in his heart so that the blood flows properly when his heart beats. So, we can talk about the problems of not eating enough meat. That's certainly an issue too. But I think that the bigger issue is that the overconsumption of meat. And also that the way that meat is generated in our culture. That's an ethical issue that we don't often tie. So I'm not saying that we should never eat meat or we shouldn't, but we do have to think about these things and think about perhaps less. This is a direct way of carrying out the very first precept of not killing. And if we can at least reduce that. So I don't know if that answers your question, Benji, but yeah.
One thing that Benji brought up is trying to convince other people how to eat. What kind of issues are brought up by that?
Yeah. yeah, and again, that goes back to Brian's point, like, what do you do for family gatherings? And how do we create an environment where there is open communication in our family, where we don't shame people for wanting to make serious changes? And, you know, it's not just about eating meat. It's like even a meditation practice or some kind of exercise. But as soon as you change a negative pattern in your life, you're bound to affect the other people who are in your immediate surroundings, who have been feeding whatever negative patterns that you've been a part of. And oftentimes these negative patterns stem from family practices that have gone unconscious. We just do them because that's the way we've been doing them. And so as soon as you introduce change, you're going to come up against some resistance, unless you do it with some degree of care and love, not shaming, not blaming. You know, I think the worst thing we can do is say, you're a meat eater and therefore you're an uncompassionate person, right? I mean, that's not going to get us very far. But you know, we need to have an environment where we can openly share our feelings. I think that's important. Can we share about the deeper issues in our families? Do we feel like we can talk with our parents about issues that are important to us, or do we feel like we have to stuff them because as soon as we bring them up, we're going to get criticized left and right? You know, this is a bigger problem, and that's why oftentimes we go to therapy, or we just end up living far away from home if we can't open up these conversations. So I would just encourage us, to what degree you have control over your family, to make it clear that you care deeply about who you're with, that you love them, and you want to know what their concerns are. And by being a model for yourself. When you're in charge, you can serve what you want. If you're the cook, you decide what you serve, and others. And you can ask for their input, but you're ultimately in charge of that. And so when you're in charge, you can be the example of what to cook and what to eat. When you're not in charge, you can still be an example. Say, you know what, I'm really considering of going vegan or vegetarian, whatever, because of health reasons. You know, if people are not in a position to talk about the ethics because of the shame and the blame number, the last thing we want to do is blame people for eating meat, but rather bring up the very serious health issues around it. And so that could be one entrance way. You know, how do we talk about this? Okay, John, yeah, bring it up.
I was just going to say, climate change is another great way to go into this. 90% of our grain in this country goes to feeding animals for consumption, and that's not efficient. You know, so we need a way to nurture our planet so that it nurtures us back.
Yeah. Were you all able to hear that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Is that John Foote?
Right. So yeah, that's John Foote. Yeah. So that's another heavy topic, is climate change. People don't want to talk. Can we talk about that? You know, it doesn't do us any good to not talk about these things, and it also doesn't do us any good to talk about them in a way that creates more pain and suffering. So we got to find that middle way, because we have some very serious issues that we're dealing with right now as a human species. Right, we're feeling the present effects of climate change as we exist, and what are we doing to address them? I think Buddhism has a lot to say here, right? The very first vow is, beings are numberless, I vow to free them. We have it written into our code of ethics that we want to do things that liberate sentient beings. So here's a tradition that is meeting the modern demand of mass extinction of species. I mean, it's not a demand, but that's what's happened. We're in in the 6th major mass extinction of species, the last one taking place 65 million years ago with the dinosaurs. Now we're in the 6th one. And we know that this is human created. Now we can go down the road of, again, we can go down the road of shame and blame and self-flagellation. I don't want to do that. We need to look at this. This is suffering, right? This is the Buddhist teachings, that there is suffering, and there's a cause to suffering, and there's an end to suffering, right? So putting those things together is our practice. How you do that, I just want to say, you have my support. I know that it's not easy, right? I know that this is not easy, but I want you to know that as far as I'm concerned, is that I support you in your efforts to end suffering. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them all, right? That's our job. And I want to give you my support in carrying that out as best you know. Listen to your gut, literally and symbolically. And, listen to your heart, right? Literally and symbolically listen to your heart too. When don't put aside the suffering of our larger society. Keep it there, because this is also the fuel for our practice. When we're down, we're like, oh, this practice is not going to get me anywhere. This is the fuel for our practice. Is that there is suffering. Sometimes it touches us directly. Sometimes it's our family or our loved ones. Sometimes it's somebody in another country. But we see this suffering, and that's the fuel for our practice. It's what can we do about it, right? That's the question we've got to keep alive.
So that's thing, I could just ask if anyone has a delicious tofu Thanksgiving recipe, please share, and I'd be grateful for that.
Awesome. Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I have the Gatha that was in Nonan's sutra book. I use the alternative. It's we venerate all life, the teachings of all awakened ones and the community of all beings. And we give thanks for this food, for the work of many people, and for the suffering of other forms of life. It doesn't say meat, plants, it just says other forms of life. And I've always responded to that one better than the taking food and drink, whatever that one is. I don't like. So I use that one at home. And it just reminds you, like Pam brought up, who said these plants are cultivated in such a loving way? When the harvester comes, we're taking away perhaps habitat for other species, and maybe they want to eat that food. Maybe So I just really like that, because it just acknowledges that when we eat, there's suffering. There's suffering no matter what we do, and it acknowledges and respects that.
Absolutely, yeah. I remember coming across the Tenzo book that was put out by Shasta Abbey. And the Tenzo writing in there is saying, don't think that because I'm a vegetarian, I'm so much better. If you can't, Uchiyama Roshi actually, he said, if you can't hear the scream of the carrot when you're cutting it, then you're not practicing deeply enough. So I think that's another point that vegetarians, people who are vegetarian or vegan, need to hear. Is because there could be the element of arrogance that comes up, like, oh, I'm not eating meat, so therefore I'm better than you. But if you can't hear the suffering of the carrot being cut, then you're not practicing deeply enough. That said, too, a carrot doesn't have a brain or a nervous system. It doesn't have the same kind of sense receptors that, say, a cow does. But keep in mind that it doesn't get us off the hook.
Right.
I just should have phrased. So the research is showing that they do, actually. So when plants are destroyed close to other plants, the plants that continue to live do respond. So, and it's relatively well proven in the scientific lexicon. But working in healthcare, yeah, your father had an unfortunate experience of eating too much meat, but we come across all the time the consequences of not eating enough. And they are as grave or graver because of breakdown of tissue, likely increase in certain cancers and so on. So Buddhism to me has always been about a balance. There's a balance. And this one is an odd one because it singles out one specific activity, the eating of meat, which we evolved to eat. That's why we need it for our health, because we are what we evolved to be. And I grew up Catholic, and I rejected Catholicism when I was 9 because of one central problem with Catholicism, or the religion I loathe, because it makes you feel bad about being alive. It makes you feel guilty about being sentient. And this is the only domain within Buddhism I've ever come across where there is this strange tendency. Basically, we eat, something dies. Unless we want to eat rocks, if we eat, something dies. That's just reality.
Right.
And Buddhism has always been about just accept what is. But in this particular domain, there's this structure of thought that to me is extremely oppressive. Where is a mollusk sentient? Is a carrot sentient? Is a cow sentient because its eyes and big eyes and can look back at you? How are we doing that? But at the bottom line, don't just feel bad about the fact that we gotta live, we gotta wait. So to me, it's one of the most difficult parts of Buddhism, which is look, a balance in everything, including balance. Can we move on?
Well, yeah, I look at a central theme of Buddhism not as accepting things the way they are, but about being mindful about every action you take and of the causes and the consequences of it. And the more you're mindful, the more you're able to make proper choices about what you're going to do. Even it's not just eating. It's in everyday life, we kill things all day long, so it's being mindful of cause and effect.
Right, the garden needs to be weeded.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're killing plants.
Oh,
At
yeah.
least you can do it mindfully.
Gardening is mass murder.
Yeah, there's always a little bit of murder whenever you garden.
Yeah.
And the bugs that are eating the plant.
Can you mindfully operate an abattoir?
Right. So just to come back, there's a story, I want to say just a couple, there's a story of a monk seeing two birds fighting over a frog, tearing it to pieces. And the monk says to his teacher, Tozan, he says, why does it come to this? And Tozan's response is, only for your benefit. Right? So, we could argue about the absolute need to eat and that creates suffering. And but I don't want to lose sight of the bigger picture of the patterns of meat consumption in the country. And I do want to promote and advocate for more mindful consumption of meat products. Right. So Thich Nhat Hanh would say some people can't go one meal without eating meat. You can go one meal without eating meat. You don't have to eat vegetarian, but you can go one meal without eating meat. Maybe it's one day a week that you decide, I'm not going to eat meat this day.
It's still operating on the presumption that there's something wrong with eating meat.
Well, that's for each of us to figure out. That's not yes, absolutely, yes. It's operating under that intention, for sure.
The trip is implicit.
It's, yeah. But yeah.
You could say that every precept is, a guilt trip, but it's not. Every precept under Buddhist philosophy is an invitation to be mindful about what you're doing.
Look, one of the, Daishin gave a great Dharma talk, I think 6 months ago, about the burning house, the metaphor of the burning house. I'm not sure if everybody was there for that, but it was this burning house, and described internally as being this awful place. And a lot of the precepts keep you out of the burning house. So for instance, intoxication keeps you out of the burning house. It's hard to make the same argument that, you know, being intoxicated is something that is good for us, leads to an increase in mindfulness, the very things we know it does not do. We also did not evolve to be intoxicated, right? So when you come back and you say, well, but let's attend to what we eat, which makes us who we are, then it's different. And a lot of the precepts are like that, you know, decisions in relation to our sexual nature, in relation to intoxication. There's just wonderful logic to considering the precepts, except this one. I find anyway, that's my personal opinion.
But I mean, to speak to that, one of the things that I really enjoy about coming and being here with all of you is this dialogue we have, because the Buddha also lied to get the story. They lied to get the children out of the burning house. Mm-hmm. So the question was, well, does Buddha say it's okay to lie? And the answer was yes, because of its skillful influence. So I enjoy this very much, that this feels like we all can question this in a way that makes me more thoughtful about what we're talking about.
First, do you feel like the way that we farm animals is okay, like generally speaking?
Absolutely not.
Okay,
so you say, no,
I'm not saying don't eat meat. I eat meat, and I have an autoimmune disease, so it's better for me to not eat meat. I tried vegan and it doesn't work for me, but when I think about animals, I see them on pasture, like a cow for instance, and I know that they're gonna go get fattened up by corn, which makes them sick.
Yes.
And we eat that sick animal. I think that has to be a consideration. How much meat we eat, like Daishin was saying, is a huge deal. We don't need to eat. Most people eat more meat than they need to in this country.
But when we're dealing with people who are over 65, which tends to be my world, right? And we look at the health problems that confront us when we deal with them, it is not overconsumption of meat. It's underconsumption because they can't afford it. And if they do eat meat, they gotta eat factory farm meat because it's the only way you can feed 350 million people.
What about the fact that they're probably eating a lot of processed stuff?
Because it's cheap.
But if they were eating, if you fill your plate up and you fill your plate up with half of nutritious vegetables that aren't expensive. They have pesticides and stuff, but the vegetables aren't as expensive as processed food. Yeah. Now the meat, I would agree that is more expensive, but you have to be able to portion that out. And this comes back to like a societal thing where we need to raise everybody up to a minimum. Everybody should feel safe, everybody should have shelter, everybody should have a right to food in this country. Yep. And we have this hierarchical society where people have billions and billions of dollars where other people have so little. So it's just like Pam was saying, let's raise everybody up to a certain level. And if you want to go beyond that for yourself, like that's great. But if we can't be compassionate to ourselves and ourselves as human beings, then how are we going to do that to this earth? And sometimes it's the other way around for people. They see the earth first because it's very innocent and pure, and they see that we're destroying it, and then it kind of work from that angle. You see the harm we're doing to the earth, you start to love the earth, and that awakens your passion for humanity. So the biggest thing for me, I would say, is if you're going to talk about this with somebody, is show them a better way. Don't just tell them what is wrong. Tell them what we can do to make it better.
And that's the challenge. In a word, protein. We've just not come up with a good way. I mean, what happens with older people is they begin to waste, right? So they don't process amino acids like they used to. So they begin to waste. And when they lose their muscular integrity and they start to lose their balance, they fall. And when they fall, they break. And when they break, they suffer terribly and die. So we've got to spend a lot of time focusing on what, like Brian put it perfectly. Anybody got a good recipe for tofu for Thanksgiving? That there are cultural questions there. But there's also the question of, look, is there a hardcore source of protein that is cheap enough for us to give access to? And unfortunately, you're stuck with meat, and specifically you're stuck with factory farm meat. It's tragic, but it's necessary. And but we're sort of, this is a kind of debate about food and all that. The point I wanted to make, and I've talked too much, was This is the one that makes us feel guilty for something we cannot stop doing because we got to eat. So why does Buddhism do this?
Are we responsible for how many
I
people's
think it only
planet,
makes
though?
you feel guilty. Fergus, just because it doesn't make me feel guilty at all. So you can't help but not kill, and that's why I like that, because you're going to kill, and that's why the suffering that prayer has, the suffering of other forms of life. It doesn't say meat, it just says suffering of other forms of life. And you can do things like, for example, I eat a lot of eggs. And you can buy eggs from pasture-raised, things like that. So the awareness of those choices. I had a chicken sandwich the other day. I normally don't eat a lot of meat, but I don't feel guilty when I do it. I just do it periodically because I know I need that protein. And I think that's the point of all of this, to think about the choices, not to shame you for eating meat. That's my understanding.
Right, yeah, if you have a choice, right, or we're not talking about people who don't have choices or are not aware of their choices. I'm just raising that we have an opportunity, or maybe that we're missing our opportunities to make choices here. So, you don't have to, just look at your choices and what's possible given your own income.
I think we're running over the time, and you're in the middle of a retreat.
We're closing it with this, so.
Oh, okay. So let's continue over tea and conversation.
Yeah, I'm sure we will.
Yeah.
Closing chant, call and response. The many beings are numberless, vowing to carry them across.
The many beings are numberless, vowing to carry them across.
Greed, anger, and ignorance rise endlessly, vowing to cut off the mind road.
Greed, anger, and ignorance rise endlessly, vowing to cut off the mind road.
Dharma gates are countless, vowing to wake to them all.
Dharma gates are countless, vowing to wake to them all.
Buddha's way is all embracing, vowing to follow through.
Buddha's way is all embracing, vowing to follow through.
Thank you, Daishin.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you guys. Good to see all of you. Thank you all for your wonderful question and discussion. Bye-bye.
Bye.